The family shoved her up the shrine steps, and the woman's back hit stone with a sound like wet leather. She will not stop. The eldest brother barked. Priest, name it. Say the name. Suspicion tightened the chronicler's ribs as he stepped from a shadowed column and watched the priest extend a palm. Suspicion, clear, specific, drove him forward. He had come to test one temple story against another, and the way this courtyard hushed into obedience felt like evidence. The courtyard smelled of smoke and sweat. The occult chronicler moved with the measured pace of a man who reads marginalia by candlelight and counts footfalls the way other men count coins. He kept his left hand on the brass magnifier at his throat and folded his shoulders against the night wind. He did not speak immediately. He watched the woman. She convulsed, jaw working, eyes unfocused. She made no request. The priest leaned close and hissed a name into her ear. The body stilled as if someone lowered a curtain on a lamp. What did you say? The brother demanded. The priest straightened and pronounced the syllable like a tali. Nakuru of rending, he held out a finger, and the crowd pressed back 3 paces. A child lowered his lantern. The chronicler felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion broadened into anger at the ceremony's precision. He listened for the ledger's scratch, for the transaction that always followed a named spirit. They carried the woman into the inner sanctuary with her wrists tied in cloth. The chronicler followed, staying near the columns where carved lions watched in profile. A scribe waited beside a wooden table with a ledger and a reed pen. He dipped the pen and wrote with a slow, practiced hand. Outside, the family murmured. Inside, the scribe stopped and read aloud what he had written. Nakuru, seizure marked, offering, 2 goats. Exile if recurring, his voice was small but exact. Scribe, the chronicler stepping forward, who decides exile. The scribe met the chronicler's gaze briefly and then ailed the ledger, sir. The ledger decides. His fingers trembled. The chronicler crouched beside the woman, while the priest painted a sigil on her forehead with charcoal and oil. The charcoal left a dark crescent that the chronicler could still name, a ritual brand, not a diagnosis. He watched the priest hold the woman's wrist and feel her pulse, as if measuring currency. This is a god, the priest said to the family. The god troubles her. We will set it out. The family knelt and pressed coins into the priest's hands. The chronicler's second emotion shift occurred here. Anger cooled into a focused resolve to prove motive, not maleficence. After the ritual, the chronicler moved toward the archive. He used the excuse of recording rites to slip through a wooden door into the temple's dim storeroom. Dust cut his nostrils. Shelves sagged with scrolls wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled a half-burned folio from a stack of damaged liturgies and unfolded it on his lap. The parchment smelled of smoke and iron. A single line in a cramped hand named another spirit, Nakuru, bringer of exile, rewarded by stone offerings. The language was bureaucratic, not mythic. It read like a regulation. He copied the line into his notebook with the brass magnifier heavy at his throat. He noted the ledger number. He snapped a page in the satchel and replaced the folio gingerly. He did not yet know why the priest favored that name, only that the temple recorded specific instructions attached to it. The chronicler felt his attention narrow into a third emotion shift, resolve moving toward methodical curiosity. He would trace the ledger numbers, the offering lists, the exile orders. The high priest found him before he reached the archive exit. He was tall, wrapped in heavier robes than the temple acolytes, and his voice was a blunt instrument. You pry where you do not belong, the high priest. His guard stepped forward and caught the chronicler's satchel strap. Who are you to read our accounts? The priest demanded. I am a chronicler of rites, the chronicler answered. I gather records. He felt his jaw tighten and his words sharpen. The records show power enacted. The high priest's eyes narrowed. Names bind. You will not speak here of binding. Remove yourself. The chronicler paused, counted the guards, and did not leave. They pushed him into the forecourt. The high priest accused him of blasphemy. The priest repeated like a verdict. The chronicler replied, "Names used as law. Names used as punishment. That is not sanctity." The priest's face went still for a fraction too long. A guard stepped forward and seized the chronicler's satchel. The man forced the satchel open. The guard's hand found a torn folio and held it up like an accusation. The chronicler spoke quickly. "Those folios are municipal. They show exile orders." The high priest spat. "Then they are impious because they serve the state." The guard's fingers closed around the chronicler's wrist. The chronicler restrained his reflex to pull away and instead met the high priest's stare. He was shoved into a passage that smelled of oil and boiled herbs. Behind a loose flagstone, an acolyte fumbled with a small clay jar. The chronicler watched the acolyte's hand slip a talisman into his own robe and then move to the woman's hair during the expulsion that night. The acolyte pocketed the offering. He caught the acolyte's sleeve in a narrow corridor and whispered, "Why do you steal offerings?" The acolyte blinked and tried to jerk free, "Because offerings feed families." The acolyte said in a voice that broke, "We send any extra to the granary. We accept what makes the temple live." The chronicler tightened his grip. "You send offerings to whom?" The acolyte answered with a single name. The magistrate. That name rearranged the chronicler's assumptions. The ritual was currency for civic power. He left the acolyte and found a village healer at dawn. The healer sat on straw mats in a hut at the village edge. She kept a tray of bitter herbs and a bundle of willow and crushed poppy. The chronicler set down the torn folio and showed her the notes. She had thrashing and noise. The healer said, "We sedate. We cleanse. We hold the family until grief eases. We watch for fever." Her hands moved with precise gestures as she described cases. "Not every seizure is a god," she said plainly. "Sometimes a fever. Sometimes a grief held in the chest until it breaks out in the limbs." The chronicler felt pity and a renewed sense of task. He had discovered a human alternative to a named spirit. That night he met a smuggler, scholar, in a moonlit alley outside the city gate. The man waited among crates and a wheelbarrow, face wrapped in cloth. The chronicler slid a coin pouch across, and the smuggler produced a small codex bound in cracked leather. "You promised secrecy," the smuggler said. "I promised coin," the chronicler answered. The smuggler opened the codex to a folded sheet, and the chronicler read aloud a passage that named Nakuru as an instrument of public order. Exile for refractory householders. Public expulsion for those whose fits endangered temple authority. He read the ledger numbers aloud, and the smuggler pointed to a marginal note. "Approved by magistrate's seal." They did not finish. Boots hit the flagstones hard. A torch flared. Temple guards appeared at the alley mouth and shouted, "Hold." The smuggler tried to tuck the codex under his cloak. A guard's spear caught the cloth, and the codex scraped open on the stone. The chronicler lunged for the pages and the guard slammed into him. The codex tore. A sheet slid free, and the chronicler caught the corner. In the scuffle, a guard's hand grabbed his satchel and felt the torn folio within. The chronicler felt his throat close with a sudden tightness. The third emotion shift became acute fear. Suspicion to anger to a sharp fear of losing evidence. "Give it here," the captain ordered. The chronicler held the folio to his chest. "It proves collusion." The chronicler. The ledger names punishments. The magistrate seals exile. The captain's face hardened. "You are a troublemaker," he said. The smuggler shoved the codex toward the chronicler. The chronicler shoved it into his satchel in a move that was more decision than panic. A guard's spear grazed his shoulder, and he tasted iron. He kept his hand on the satchel strap until the guard's searching fingers relaxed. The captain barked orders and they formed a line. The chronicler felt the weight of the torn folio like a small, hot stone. He returned to the inn where he lodged beneath a corrugated awning near the caravan road. He sat at a narrow table and spread the rescued fragments under a guttering lamp. He matched marginal numbers, ledger stamps, and the magistrate's seal to the temple lists. The folio showed a pattern. Temples that named spirits also recorded exile orders tied to recurring disturbances, and magistrates collected the fines and redistributed offerings for civic projects. The chronicler wrote in his journal with short strokes and a steady hand. He checked a column twice. He felt the final emotion shift of the chapter. Fear settling into wary clarity. He would not only gather names, he would trace how naming madness became civic routine. At midnight, a soft knock came to his door in the Caravan Inn. He clenched his jaw and thumbed the brass magnifier. He wrapped the torn folios in oilcloth and slid them into a hidden pocket in his satchel among bone amulets and a worn journal. He checked the knots twice. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps followed by a pause. He did not answer at once. He listened for footsteps on the stairs, for any voice. The chronicler did not imagine fate. He made a choice. He moved the satchel under the cot, took a single log from the hearth, and did not look at the door when it opened. "Who is there?" he called at last, keeping his voice low. A man in plain clothes pushed the door inward a sliver. His face was partly in shadow from the lintel. His fingers tapped a ridge in his palm. "A messenger," the man said from the road. "There are travelers with fever." The magistrate sends a request for clerical aid. The chronicler watched the man's hands. They were steady. He thought of the acolyte's stolen talisman, of the ledger numbers of the magistrate's seal. He heard the man's steps move away down the corridor. He heard the messenger's sandals stop at the door and then go. The chronicler felt his pulse slow. He left the door unlocked but did not leave the room. He lit a candle and prepared a separate bundle with the folio he had torn from the codex. He slid that page into a slot in his journal and tied the journal to the satchel strap, where the bone amulet would press the fragment into place. He tested the weight. He listened for a sound in the hall. None came. The chronicler set the satchel by his foot and sat in the chair, hands folded over the brass magnifier. He knew 2 things now. Temples named madness to enforce exile, and magistrates filled their coffers from offerings. He also knew that some villagers treated the same symptoms with herbs and care. He had evidence and he had a plan. He rose before dawn and packed the satchel carefully. He tucked the charred folio, the ledger copies, and a smuggled codex fragment into separate, labeled wrappings. He checked his ring with the unreadable sigil and felt the indented metal. It steadied him. He packed a change of robes and a little oil for the lamp. The chronicler adjusted his spectacles on his head and felt the thin scar along his left eyebrow pull. He walked to the window and watched the caravan lane emptying into a pale light. He made one last action. He stuck the torn folio into the lining of his satchel, among talismans, and closed the clasp. A small sound came from the corridor then, footsteps distant and purposeful. He lifted the satchel and stepped out into the lane, leaving the inn's lantern guttering in a wind that carried no words. Every decision in the chapter had consequences he could already trace. The family had sought divine naming to explain suffering and secure a ritual solution. The temple turned that need into income and civic control. The magistrate accepted the exchange. The acolyte stole offerings to help kin. The healer refused exile and offered treatment. The chronicler now held a torn piece of the ledger and a smuggled codex that linked ritual naming to state punishment. Night had given him immediate threats and evidence that fit together. He set his face toward the road to the next shrine, the satchel heavy against his hip. When he crossed the courtyard threshold, the sun touched the carved lion's nose and shed a hard, clean line across the stone. He walked into that line, and the city gates shut behind him. He had no illusions of a single revelation. He had a mandate. Follow named madness across temples until the ledger pattern broke. He would not claim to have solved those lives. He would only map the system that named them, expose the motives behind the names, and record those lists so that another chronicler might compare a shrine's ledger to a healer's notes and see which practice served people and which served power. He tightened the strap and left the city, The torn folios folded beneath his satchel-s flap, and a nearby pair of boots passing him on the road. He did not yet know which shrine would reveal the next inked name, nor whether a magistrate in another town accepted offerings in the same way. He only knew the immediate facts: ledger numbers, a magistrate's seal, an acolyte's furtive hand, and a healer who could name physical remedies when a priest named a god. He had evidence and a direction. He pulled his robe tighter against the morning air and began to trace the ledger's path to the horizon. He reached a small rise and looked back once. The city's walls sat in the valley behind him, a blocky silhouette with carved reliefs catching the early light. He smoothed the satchel strap, checked again for the folios, and kept walking. He had made a choice that the temple could not simply file away. He would follow the named gods until he could show where naming became punishment and where care had been denied in its name. He walked on, and while the road rose and turned, someone inside the city bent over a ledger and circled a name. The chapter closes on a concrete action. The chronicler slips the last torn folio beneath his satchel flap, ties the strap tight, and puts his hand on the brass magnifier as he steps past a cart of olives into the road. Footsteps follow at a measured distance behind him. Emotion roots suspicion, emotion shifts, suspicion, anger, resolve, fear, clarity. A woman convulsed against the stone steps as Ibrahim shouted, "Priest, name it! Say the spirit's name now!" The crowd leaned forward. Someone hissed for silence and a child began to cry. The chronicler felt suspicion from the first moment he pushed between bodies and smelled sweat and oil. That suspicion made him reach for Keston's hands instead of merely watching. He could not simply record. He moved closer to the healer's work table and let his fingers rest on the edge of a folded codex while his eyes catalogued the rite in progress. Context arrived in the next 2 sentences. This courtyard lay along the river trade road, and the family who had carried Mara up the shrine steps a fortnight earlier were the same people from the chronicler's earlier note. He remembered the sound when her back hit stone in that memory. The chronicler had seen that report. He had written the single line in his journal, and then come because the earlier account raised questions that ink could not answer. Now he stood inside the same drama, and suspicion pushed him to test what the healer said aloud as law. The healer's courtyard smelled of river mud, tallow, and boiled herbs. Keston, a broad-shouldered man with a stained robe, held Mara's wrist and spoke a litany. Mara's body jerked and her eyes rolled. Ibrahim planted his palms on his knees and spat between teeth. "Name it, Keston," he demanded. "Name it so we can know whether she must leave or be kept. Name it for the magistrate." The chronicler tightened his grip on his journal and moved to read a marginal note Keston had scribbled earlier. His hands trembled, but not from fear. He had learned to steady a hand for cold ink. Asha stepped into the courtyard then, her satchel slung at her hip, and she said, "Stop. Let me examine her." Her tone cut across the ritual patterns like a blade across rope. The crowd shifted. Keston's voice hardened. "This is not your business, Asha. This is a naming rite." Ibrahim barked. "She will not stop. We will not carry her to the river again." The chronicler watched Asha kneel beside Mara and unzip the cloth covering the woman's temple. Asha's fingers pressed at the scalp and shoulder. She said, "These trimmers do not match possession." Her sentence hung as an accusation in the open air. That exchange produced the first doubt in the chronicler. Suspicion had set him at the table. Asha's examination supplied a new pattern. He had to choose between attending the rite and corroborating an empirical note. He folded the codex cover back and began to copy Keston's marginalia onto a spare leaf. His copying was deliberate. He wanted the handwriting, the ink blots, and the sigils to exist outside the healer's tent. When Keston noticed him, the healer's jaw tightened. "You take my notes and you make trouble." "Keston, I only record what you write," the chronicler replied. His voice was low. "I will not decide for your people." He kept his hand on the codex and felt the raised chords where the book had been repaired. His suspicion shifted toward a practical question. Did the ritual diagnosis alter people's legal fates? The envoy from Magistrate Varron arrived folded into that question. A man in a stiff cloak and a slim iron pin at his throat stepped through the gate and closed it behind him. He carried a rolled decree, and the attention of the crowd snapped to him. The envoy of Magistrate Varron, Keston, the magistrate requires a named cause. If this is possession, we will quarantine. If this is disease, we will remove her to the infirmary. He unrolled the paper and set the city seal where everyone could see it. The chronicler watched Ibrahim's face fall into a calculation. A named spirit would mean the family could plead for ritual remedy. A medical verdict would force them to rely on scarce civic services. Keston raised his voice and gestured at the torchlight. Naming is what we do. Naming binds the thing to remedy, Asher answered. Naming also binds the accused to punishment when those names carry law. Her sentence forced a public choice. The chronicler recorded the line, copying Keston's sigil into his own margin. Doubt became urgency when the envoy asked, "Healer, do you have records to support this name?" Keston ran a wet thumb across a page and produced a list of epithets. The envoy's hand brushed the paper without taking it. The courtyard split into two motions. The rite continued, and the magistrate's sergeant acted as if he could interrupt it with civic force. Mara's body convulsed harder. The chronicler's suspicion shifted again, this time toward fear. Fear that naming would be used not only to heal but to hide. He watched Keston's thumb pause over one sigil, the same mark that had been in the codex he had opened earlier. The healer's hand trembled minutely, and he looked away. Later, beneath a woven awning, Asher pulled Mara's tunic aside to inspect old bruises. "She has sores along the scalp and a fever pattern. Asher, these are signs I treat." Ibrahim cut in, "Treat her then. Or name it and free us to move on." His voice was a cliff of accusation aimed at the healer. Keston answered, "If I name her, I do what the ancestors taught me to do." He touched a small bone amulet at his throat. The chronicler watched the exchange and felt the emotional pressure change again. Doubt to anger, he wrote the phrase naming controls law into his journal. Asher and Keston argued in short lines now. "Keston, you bind people to what you name." Asher, "Keston, what authority do you answer?" "I answer to the shrine and the patrons that keep our town safe." Keston, "Asher, you answer to what?" "A book you read in a city." Asher's eyes narrowed. "I answer to the sick." The chronicler stepped between them and asked, "Who receives the recorded names? Who keeps a registry?" Keston glanced toward his tent where a bundle of bound folios lay. He hesitated before answering. "The names go into the ledger kept for patrons." "The ledger is not public." The chronicler's pen stopped. This private ledger pointed straight at the possibility of political sheltering. The chronicler's fingers returned to the margins of Keston's codex when he slipped away later into the healer's tent. The tent smelled of dried ruined iron. He copied a marginal note and found half hidden beneath a fold. The sigil he had seen in the codex earlier and a sequence of letters that matched a suppressed cult name he had read about in a trade mercantile complaint months before. He lifted his head. Keston stood in the doorway. "You are very careful with other people's names." "Keston." His voice was flat. "You write as though you own them." The chronicler held the copied sigil between two fingers. "I do not own names. I record who uses them and why." Keston's mouth tightened. He stepped back but did not deny possession. The patrons protect many things. A name is not only a cause. The chronicler wanted to ask what patrons meant here, but the healer's flinch when the sigil was revealed said more than words. The chronicler registered a sudden shift. Suspicion had widened into the fear that naming served patrons and rulers more than sufferers. An external event changed the courtyard again. The envoy returned with a small guard and a short order. He posted a seal on Keston's gate and read aloud an instruction. "For the safety of the town, the magistrate will confiscate any records that name clandestine orders. Any person found facilitating secret patronage will be detained." The crowd muttered. Ibrahim's face hardened into a new set of lines. "They will take everything from you," he said to Keston. Keston's shoulders fell. He pushed a hand into his robe, and the chronicler glimpsed the edge of another folio, hastily hidden. At night, torches threw hard light and long shadows across the courtyard. Keston performed a rite under pressure. He smeared ash, tied cords, and fed a small bundle of herbs into a brazier. Mara convulsed beside him. Keston intoned a syllable that the chronicler had both seen and copied before. Then Mara's voice came out of her in a tone that was not hers. "I am," Mara rasped, and the words fell heavy. The chronicler felt the room tilt into a new calculation. The name she spoke matched the marginal letters the chronicler had copied and the suppressed cult name from the mercantile complaint. The crowd gasped. Ibrahim caught at Asher's sleeve and said, "You heard her! You heard it!" Asher's jaw tightened. "Mara, say it again," Keston demanded. The woman's eyes darted like a trapped animal's. She the name twice in a raw voice. The chronicler's fear hardened into alarm. The name linked a private illness to a clandestine order. For a single moment the space between people became a map of possible punishments and alliances. If the magistrate traced the name, families tied to the patron might be exposed. If the patron's cover was pierced, the healer would be punished. If the healer was protected, the family would have to give something in return. The envoy of Magistrate Varon stepped forward, read the name aloud to confirm it, and then paled. He moved toward the gate and barked orders. That moment was the chapter's climax. Guards surged, sealing the courtyard gates. The magistrate declared an emergency and began to detain those who carried folios with the mark. Ibrahim shouted that Keston had betrayed them. Keston answered with a quick, low voice, "I named her to save her." The patrons require this name. The chronicler felt the crowd fracture. Loyalty, fear, and accusation mixed into action. He slipped a copy of the marginalia into his satchel while he helped Asher hide the rest of her notes beneath a loose floorboard in the makeshift sickbed. The arrests came quick. A hand grabbed Keston's sleeve and produced a warrant. The envoy read charges of secret patronage and false remedy. Keston tried to explain, but the magistrate's authority cut him off. "You will come with us." "The ledger goes to the magistrate's chest." Asher pushed at the guard and said, "You have no right to take everything." A guard shoved her, and Ibrahim lunged to protect his sister. A rapid exchange of lines followed. "Ibrahim, stop! Don T, touch him! You are under arrest." "She is sick." The chronicler recorded the names of those detained and watched the family fall into the category they feared most, accused instead of clients. After the crowd was controlled and the courtyard emptied into the magistrate's wagons, the chronicler and Asher climbed to a rented room above the market. Asher's hands trembled when she set Mara's pulse aside from her instruments. The chronicler produced the copied folio and laid it on the table. "The name ties to trade routes," he said. "It is used in distant caravans and the merchant houses use it as a marker. This isn't a local possession. It's a network." Asher read the letters, then rubbed her forehead. "So the healer's naming binds these families into a greater system," she said. They worked through the night. The chronicler recorded, Asher catalogued symptoms, and together they mapped the possible routes the name could have carried. Each new page they found in Keston's tent that they could hide became evidence and risk. Doubt changed now into resolve. Both felt pushed to follow the trail despite the danger. The chronicler covered his notes with beeswax and sealed the bundle inside a hollowed codex binding. "If they take the ledger," he said, "they will not find this copy." Asher tied the satchel strap tight. She spoke with a quiet steadiness. "At dawn we go to the river warehouses and ask the merchant clerks what they know. If the name appears on invoices, then this is larger than a healer's patron." The chronicler nodded. He had moved from suspicion into a formal plan. A twist arrived before they could leave. A woman from the crowd found their window and knocked. She carried a wet shawl and blood on her palm. "They took my brother," she said. He was among those with folios. The magistrate will burn the ledgers at dawn. Her face carried a blunt certainty that forced the chronicler to act faster. He rose, wrapped the folio, and told Asher, "We cannot wait for the magistrate's bonfire." Asher already had a list of merchant names. They gathered the sealed codex and a few instruments, and the chronicler counted the hours until light. In the final paragraphs, the chronicler recorded the night's decisions as concrete motions. The satchel was hidden under the bed. A spare tunic was sewn with a secret pocket. Asher slipped a small vial of antiseptic into the chronicler's coat. They agreed on first steps and rotes. The chronicler closed his journal, placed the copied marginalia inside a waxed folder, and slid it beneath his coat. He spoke a single line to Asher. "At first light we follow the river clerks. We do not speak of patrons in the open," Asher answered. "We take only what helps Mara and the others. We do not make enemies we cannot face." The chronicler felt the last of the fear settle into a cold readiness. He lit a candle and wrote a note to the magistrate's envoy, a record of what he had observed, not an accusation. When he put the note into the satchel, a firm knock came at the door. He stood, pocketed his pen, and opened the latch to find a courier with a seal he did not expect. The courier held a small bundle and said, "From Keston. Take this to the ledger under your care." The chronicler took the parcel and slipped it inside his robe. The last line of the chapter is the latch closing behind him as footsteps passed below and the candle guttered, leaving the chronicler to count the hours until dawn and the journey that would follow. They shoved her through the canvas and her shoulder hit the pole with a dull crack. A boy shouted, "Priest, name it now!" The occult chronicler's hands tightened on his journal. Suspicion rooted him to the ragged threshold. He watched breath form in the cool dusk and heard the family's demand like an edict. The central problem was immediate. A name would decide who controlled the woman and what the village would owe. He stepped inside without announcing himself. The tent smelled of boiled herbs and hot oil. He moved around a stretcher to see Miriam kneeling, palms pressed flat to a woman's lashing back. The patient kept her eyes open but without focus. Ibrahim stood with a strip of cloth coiled in his hand. The chronicler recorded the scene, watching how suspicion held him to details, the angle of a priest's chin, the way Saul's fingers avoided the patient's wrist. That suspicion guided every choice. He did not intervene at once. Saul the healer needed the patient's temple's name. Miriam hissed, "Call the spirit so we may send it away." Saul's jaw tightened. "Not without payment," he said. "You know the rule," Ibrahim barked. "Payment or naming." The chronicler copied their words into a narrow column in his notebook. The exchange was not simply between belief and remedy. It was bargaining. The chronicler had seen a similar public naming before. He remembered a stone shrine outside a desert hamlet where a man had forced a woman up narrow steps and swore she would not stop moving until the priest pronounced a spirit's name. That day the name changed the family's fate. He kept that earlier memory like a map, a concrete report. The family's foot on the shrine stone, the woman's breath ripping, a priest whispering a syllable that made the crowd step back. Here, in the tent, the mechanics repeated. He felt doubt prick him now where suspicion had been a steady flame. "Saul, Ibrahim again, we need certainty. Speak plainly. Is this spirit from the river or the dead?" Saul pressed his thumb against the woman's wrist and did not speak the way a physician might. Instead he turned his head and scanned the courtyard where the elder waited under lamplight. The chronicler noticed the elder's set mouth and the way villagers edged in tight knots. The social pressure tightened like a band across the scene. An acolyte slipped close to the chronicler as if the tent walls had ears. Lena moved with quick, nervous steps. She folded a scrap and tucked it into his palm without meeting his eyes. He flattened the paper with a single finger. The scrap listed names and sums beside them. The chronicler's breath shortened. Payment listed as coin, exchange of favors, promised land. He read numbers, not syllables of spirits. Doubt shifted to a colder clarity. Names were commodities. Lena, he asked quietly, where did you get this? She answered in a voice too small for the courtyard, from Saul's ledger. The acolyte who keeps accounts sells the lists when the house grows strict. The market wants certainty now. They set prices to bind people. Her hands trembled as she explained. The chronicler snapped a pen cap and wrote, Ledger Saul, acolyte, prices. He recorded the fact without editorializing. He watched Saul's fingers make a motion, not of healing, but of counting an invisible tally. Outside, the elder's voice rose, enough! Name it before rumor eats us alive. A cluster of villagers shouted agreement. The chronicler felt the pressure of the crowd through the thin canvas. Miriam rocked on her knees beside the patient's head. Please, she said to Saul, we have nothing else. Tell me what to do. Saul's eyes flicked to the elder, then to Ibrahim. He set his jaw and stood. In the courtyard, the chronicler saw the ritual shift from private aid to public authority. Saul moved a low stool into the center of the tent and set a small bundle of dated talismans on top. He arranged coins and a chipped bowl. He did not call on the old names used in the shrine. Instead, he unrolled a narrow strip of parchment, read a single name aloud, and held the sound for the crowd like a breath held between two people. It answers to Hutha. Saul. The name landed into the tent and the woman convulsed as if something inside her had been struck. The chronicler wrote the name and the reaction. He watched the child's cry catch, smelled sweat and oil and fear. The patient's limbs asked, the family shouted. Ibrahim moved forward with the cloth. The healer's hands made a strict motion across the woman's brow. For a moment the tent became a living ledger where a syllable produced a physical reply. The convulsions intensified. The healer's chant increased. He struck a shallow gong and the sound rang thin in the dusk. The chronicler moved closer and watched Saul's mouth work. He kept his pen poised. The patient stopped mid-arc and stared at Saul with something like recognition. The chronicler noted the micro-movements. The way the patient's fingers flexed toward the talismans, the way the healer's knuckles went white on the edge of the bowl. That was the first shift, suspicion to fear. The chronicler felt fear travel through his ribs, not as abstract dread, but as a cold that made his hands steady. A voice from the tent mouth cut straight. Saul, how much? The elder demanded, how much for certainty? Saul named an amount and a concession, 3 goats and my public sanction in the market for a full pronouncement at the spring festival. Miriam gasped. We don't have 3 goats, she said. Not now. Ibrahim spat into the dirt. The chronicler watched the exchange. He saw how naming bound the family to the healer, and how a public sanction converted into market power. Lena touched the chronicler's sleeve and whispered, names are traded from house to house. Priests swap favored syllables for land deeds. Healers sell certainty when harvests fail. She forced the words out. The chronicler looked at the ledger scrap again. The list contained names he had seen scribbled in older manuscripts, variations, margins marked by a practiced hand. A twist grew in his mind. The names had histories, and those histories were pruned and repurposed by the men who held the ledgers. The elder's hand moved like a gavel. We need this settled now, he said. You, Saul, will speak. We will pay later. We must keep order. Saul hesitated. The chronicler watched the hesitation and the calculation behind it. That moment of pause was an event. Power weighed against risk. The healer's eyes flicked to Miriam. He cupped his mouth and murmured something only she could hear. She nodded, and the villagers leaned forward. Saul began the named ritual with a scraping breath. He struck a lighted wick into a bowl and held the smoke toward the woman's face. He repeated the syllable once, twice, 3 times. The patient howled and rolled. Then the voice from the patient changed. It was a guttural sound that forced people to step back. For the chronicler, the third shift arrived. From fear to a brittle clarity, a recognition that the performance itself produced effect. The tent ruptured. The patient lurched and struck the altar so hard a brass lamp toppled. Flames licked a corner. Someone screamed for water. The elder lunged to douse the lamp, and the bowl of talismans scattered into the dirt. A child tried to catch a falling coin, and the coin slipped between fingers. In the scramble, a scrap of parchment blew out through the tent flap and vanished into the courtyard shadows. The chronicler reached for it, but Ibrahim's foot pinned his hand. "What did you take?" Ibrahim demanded. He twisted the chronicler's wrist. "Are you a spy?" The chronicler kept his voice low. "I record. I ask questions. No spy." Miriam pulled at Ibrahim. "Let him go." "He's not a thief," the elder barked. "Hold him until we know what's true." Lena gripped the chronicler's elbow and hissed. "They will burn the ledger if we do not get it out." Her voice broke. The event forced a compact decision: smuggle evidence or yield to the elder's order. In the rush, a man stepped from the shadows and lifted a scrap of paper where the lamp had blown a patch of light. He turned it so the chronicler could see a single line, a name paired with a village boundary and the mark of a trader. The chronicler's pen hovered. He felt both anger and a new instrumented clarity, the knowledge that a name could be sold in a market meeting, the next trade day, for a fixed price. He saw how a family handed over goats and land to buy silence. A confrontation followed. The man who recovered the scrap was not Saul. He was a trader named Harun who regularly appeared at the spring market and sold salted fish and incense. "This goes public now," Harun allowed. Saul's face changed. "Harun, you cannot." Saul began. The trader's shoulders lifted. "I can." "Harun, names pay for my stock." "Names pay for the caravan." Lena's eyes widened. The chronicler noted each syllable. The argument produced rapid lines of trade-off. Saul pleading, Harun stating market logic, Ibrahim threatening exile, the elder demanding order. "Saul," the elder said sharply, "is this true?" Saul looked at Miriam, at the patient, then at the ledger in Harun's hand. He swallowed. "Sometimes names are shared between houses, Saul. Sometimes priests lend a syllable for a season. Sometimes we charge a ripple of noise made people speak at once." Miriam cried, "You used my daughter for profit." Saul's shoulders tightened. "We sought to help," he said. "We maintain the rights. We pay the temple's dues." The chronicler felt betrayal rise in measured steps. The event changed how he would report the sanctity of names. Lena stepped forward and put her palm on Saul's arm. Her voice steadied. "You taught me the ledger's code," she said. "You me which names were free and which were priced. I saw the lists when I cleaned the hut." Saul's face went hard like struck metal. He spat. "Lena, you should not speak of accounts." The elder moved the argument into accusal. 3 to 6 short lines flew between them. "Lena, be quiet. This is true. You would betray the house. We bind the village for stability." The back and forth revealed alliances and stakes. The patient rose in the chaos and knocked over a bench. She stood on wobbly legs and pointed at Harun. Her voice was thin but clear. He brought the paper. The tent fell into a new silence. The chronicler stepped closer to hear. The patient's finger trembled. Miriam ran to her side and pressed her forehead to the woman's shoulder. "Tell them, please." "Miriam." The patient's lips formed a name that had not appeared on any ledger. An older syllable that belonged to a different region. Harun's hand tightened on the scrap and his face changed. The mini cliffhanger came then. Harun's jaw dropped and he let slip a name that contradicted the ledger's entry. If that name is true, then the market murmur will move north and the buyers will pull back. For a moment no one breathed. The chronicler felt the tent tilt under a new possibility. Traders might withdraw their goods if the wrong spirit was named. The stakes multiplied from a family's debt to a regional supply chain. Saul swore under his breath and lunged for Harun, but Ibrahim stepped in. "We will not have a brawl in my courtyard." "Ibrahim." The elder raised his hand like a judge. He ordered Saul and Harun to stand apart. "We will hold a council tomorrow at dawn by the well," he said. "Bring witnesses and the ledger. If names were traded, bring proof. We will decide then." The crowd dispersed in murmurs. The chronicler watched people file past the tent. carrying the lamp and the scattered talismans. He felt the night's arc settle into a new purpose. Gather evidence. After the courtyard emptied, Lena pulled the chronicler aside into a narrow alley. Rain had started tapping the tent canvas with a thin persistence. "I can show you the ledger," she whispered, "but not here. Meet me by the salt store at first light." The chronicler looked at her. He measured her face, young, tight-lipped, with an urgency that read like guilt. "Lena, if this is true, many will lose their livelihoods. Why risk it?" She pressed a folded coin into his palm. "Because I cannot watch another family trade a child for bread," she said. Her voice cracked and she swallowed. Doubt returned, then shifted again into resolve. He returned to his room with notes scattered like a surgeon's instruments. He lit a candle and spread the scraps across the table. He reread source name Harron's mark, the elder's order, the patient's sudden naming. He catalogued the events. Tent naming, ledger slip, trader's contradiction, council at dawn, Lena's meeting. Each notation clarified which next steps mattered. He wrote the word market in bold and circled ledger. The chronicler understood now that ritual naming operated as an economy. Outside, the rain built into a steady sound that pressed against his window. He set the ledger scrap beside his satchel, checked the brass magnifier on its chain, and folded the paper into a pocket. He felt fatigue in his shoulders but not relief. The chapter's small conflict had resolved into a clear decision. Follow the ledger to its source, or allow the village's ritual market to stand as before. The chronicler chose to follow. He closed his journal and heard, at once, a knock at his door. He opened it to find a soaked Lena holding a dripping palm-sized token and saying one line. "There is a list at the trader's house. Follow the river road at dawn." He did not answer with philosophy. He took the token, felt its ragged edges, and stepped into the night to plan the next move. He forced the loft hatch and the ledger dropped into his lap, dust bursting against his mouth. Suspicion tightened his shoulders as he thumbed the moth-eaten cover and felt folded petitions slide like trapped moths. The occult chronicler had come to the temple to record ritual liturgy. Instead, he found a stack of petitions and a list of names that smelled of oil and old ink. The ledger's edges had been thumbed thin. Its margins were crowded with small notations that promised reasons and prices. The problem was clear. These names bound people to punishments, rents, and favors. He set suspicion as the engine of his next steps and refused to let the village version of piety stand untested. He closed the hatch but left the loft ladder loose. He moved so the ladder made no more noise than a settling beam. He pulled the ledger onto his knees and began to read aloud in a voice meant to steady his hands. Entry 1, Hannon seizure. Payment, 2 goats, land 10 cubits. He paused and tasted dust. He read another line, entry 7, Basha madness, public naming, debt forgiven. The words were small and blunt. He remembered the woman carried to a shrine steps in an earlier night, when the family pushed her body against stone and asked the priest to name the spirit. He could still hear the shout, Ibrahim's demand for a name. That memory lay under his hands now, concrete and recorded. He stacked 3 petitions and flattened them with his palm. He could feel the ledger's spine under his fingers and the deliberate economy of its entries. A note in the margin caught him. As agreed, collect half before naming. He read the words twice. He felt doubt sharpen into anger. He rose and carried the ledger down the loft ladder, legs steady but quick. In the courtyard gate, Ibrahim met him with 2 acolytes and a braided rope coiled at his hip. Ibrahim's face had the same impatience that had made him shout in the earlier rite. He spoke first. Chronicler, give that book. The voice was short. The occult chronicler set the ledger on the gate post with his palm. Why do you want it, Ibrahim? He asked, keeping the ledger between them. Ibrahim's jaw worked. It belongs to the temple. Hand it over. He glanced at the acolytes. The chronicler held his ground. It belongs to the people who petitioned. The names are public. His tone was flat. He showed one petition, folded and worn. A child had drawn a cross in its margin. The eldest brother arrived, hair wet from a morning bath, eyes red. He shouldered forward and said, "Name it now. Name the spirit so this ends." His words contained the same demand that had filled the market when they once shoved a woman through a tent pole and called for the priest to speak a spirit's name. The eldest brother's voice carried the weight of shame and a hunger for closure. A midwife named Isha pushed through the crowd. She smelled of heated cloth and iron. "Wait," she said, "we must listen to the chronicler. Let him say what he found." Her hands were steady on the afflicted woman's arm. The woman sagged on a stranger's shoulder, hair soaked in dried blood. The chronicler's eyes rested on that face, and the thin braided scar on one cheek, proof of an earlier scuffle. The crowd closed, a ring that made the gate a stage. The high priest arrived, slow and deliberate, with the acolyte who had been at the shrine the night of the naming. He wore the temple sash. He kept his hands close to his chest. "What is this?" he demanded. "Who opens sacred storage?" His question sought both ownership and insult. The chronicler answered without rising from the gate post. "I found entries that tie names to fines and land transfers. The ledger is not a record of miracles. It is a register of transactions. It would change what people think of this place." He set the ledger down and opened to the marginal notation he had seen in the loft. He read aloud, voice steady. "If naming secures debt, then naming shall be withheld until coin appears." A silence fell, brief and hard. Then the eldest brother barked, "You insult the priest." He jabbed a finger toward the high priest. "Name the spirit, father, or give us proof you did not profit from this family's shame." His words pushed for spectacle. The high priest paled under his paint. He reached for the ledger, but the chronicler's hand closed over the page. Acolytes moved to seize the book. One of them lunged. "Stop!" Aisha snapped, stepping between the acolyte and the chronicler. Her voice was sharp, natural authority. "Ibrahim, hold back your men. We will not have a scuffle here." She addressed Ibrahim directly. Ibrahim's face tightened. "Aisha, you know what naming does?" He shifted his weight. Aisha's hand tightened on the afflicted woman's wrist. "I know what failing to name does too. We heal or we harm. We do not become instruments for private gain." She held the woman's eyes. The woman blinked and tried to speak. Only a gurgle came out. The chronicler recorded each movement on a small scrap of paper, fingers steady despite a sudden pressure behind his ribs. Suspicion had seeded doubt. Doubt moved to anger. Anger softened into sharp curiosity when he saw the legis marginalia that tied men's names to favors. The high priest's acolyte flicked the ledger toward the priest. The pages fanned and a thin strip of paper fell out. The eldest brother stooped and picked up the strip. He frowned and read aloud. "If named in the market, grant seller stole to temple record. Market day, the 2nd. His voice carried across the crowd. The chronicler felt a shift under his skin. The crowd's mood adjusted. What had been near religious certainty thinned. A murmur rose. "They took my stall last month." Someone said, "They made my rent go to the temple." A woman spat. A boy started to cry. The chronicler watched shoulders slump and voices harden. The ledger had turned a private ritual into public accounting. The high priest raised his hands. "This is a misunderstanding. These are notes on charity, on offerings. We do not trade names for land." He used the language of piety to shore up his claim. "Then show the receipts." The eldest brother shot back. "Show the names of those who paid." He looked at Ibrahim. "Ibrahim, you stood by that night. Tell the truth. Tell us who benefited." The demand hit like a stone. Ibrahim breathed sharply. He glanced at the high priest and then at the crowd. "I did not name for coin," he said, "but orders come from above." He did not name who above that was. The chronicler leaned forward and lifted the ledger, testing the crowd's attention. He turned pages until he found a pattern of short entries that repeated one phrase. As adjudicated by Temple, he read 3 entries in a row, and the sound of his voice made the market taste colder. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Show us the family who paid." The eldest brother pushed forward, and the afflicted woman's head lolled. She tried to stand but fell back on Aisha. Blood smeared the hem of her garment. The priest gestured toward the ritual platform. If we cannot settle this here, we shall call a rite. The naming will be done publicly. Let ritual decide. His voice hardened into command. This moved everyone toward noon. The chronicler felt the situation tighten and made a decision. He would not let the ledger be removed. He closed it and tucked it under his arm. We will not turn this into a spectacle, he said. Read the ledger in public. Let names and entries be seen. If the temple fears exposure, then the temple must answer in daylight. His words aimed to change the frame from private accusation to public record. They built a platform under the market's open sky. Elders argued over who would speak. The high priest arranged his robe as if preparing for a sermon. The chronicler sat with the ledger on his knees, and the afflicted woman a few paces to his left, tended at times by Aisha. The eldest brother circled, eyes like a judge. Townspeople filled alleys and windows. The mood had split. Some protected the temple, some demanded accounting. The high priest began the rite with a chant. He intoned the familiar words, and the crowd fell into a practiced silence. He looked at the ledger as if expecting it to explode to proof of his innocence. The chronicler opened the book and read the ledger's marginal note that tied naming to fines. He read the handwriting that indicated explicit instructions. At naming, collect share. If family resists, escalate penalty. The crowd stiffened. An acolyte lunged to take the ledger. He was a thin man with a quick hand. Acolyte, give the book to the priest. He reached. The chronicler grabbed the arm and twisted. Back, his voice was a low command. A short exchange followed, 6 quick lines. Acolyte, let go. I will not be ordered by a stranger. You are ordered by the people. The people obey the priest. Then the people must choose. We will not be made fools. The words cut and overlap. Voices rose. In the throng, the eldest brother moved like a battering ram and struck the acolyte who had reached for the ledger. The acolyte fell. The chronicler shoved to his feet and pushed the ledger onto the platform. The high priest shouted for silence and called for the rite to continue. He lifted his hands and the acolytes formed a human wedge around him. The crowd surged. At the height of the chaos, the afflicted woman made a sound that was neither plea nor cry. She wrenched free from Aisha and staggered forward. Her fingers closed on the ledger's open edge, and she ripped a page free. She held it up with trembling hands. Look, she said. Her voice rounded in the market. Look at my name. She thrust the page toward the high priest. You wrote my name here. You wrote I owed land and goats. You wrote I was cursed so the temple could take our land. Her lips trembled, but she spoke with a clarity that made the market hush. The eldest brother grabbed the page and read, Hanan, named on market day. Temple claim activated. He held the paper as if it burned him. Around them, people who had once bowed now stared with disbelief. The high priest hand shook. The acolytes tried to reclaim the page. A scuffle erupted. The eldest brother pushed the acolyte who reached for Hanan's paper. During the scuffle, the chronicler heard a sound he had not expected. A small whistle from the side alley. A man with soot on his face and sweat in his hair pushed forward and held a sealed note up for the crowd to see. Hear me! He called, I sold my stall to the temple after I was named. They promised land in return. That land is now someone else's. He dropped the note on the ground and stamped his foot. The crowd's anger focused. Men who had once accepted small humiliations found a lever. A woman spat and then spoke the name of a merchant who had lost his stall. Suddenly there were lists, names of sellers, dates, transactions. One after another, people spoke their losses. The ledger had exposed a pattern. The crowd's mood sharpened from confusion to accusation to fury. The high priest tried to regain control. Stop these lies. He cried, this is a slander. The temple feeds the poor. His voice cracked. Ibrahim surged forward. You are to follow orders. You are to record names. I followed. I will answer for my hands, but not alone. He looked at the high priest, who ordered this. he demanded. The high priest looked away and then reached for a side robe. He pulled out a sealed strip and tore it open. "These orders come from the council in the city." He lied. His lie was small and precise. The eldest brother spat on the ground. "We were never told," he said. "They took our land while we begged for names to save our daughter." The words were blood and reason together. The scuffle continued until someone pushed the high priest and he slipped, scattering ceremonial oil. The acolytes formed a circle and the priest managed to slip through them and run. He vanished down a back lane, robes streaming behind him. Men shouted and a few ran after him. The eldest brother tried to pursue, but others grabbed his arms and held him back. Someone had tied Ibrahim's hands with a rope and then cut it again. His face looked smaller for a moment. In the confusion, the chronicler was struck from behind. He fell hard and felt a hot scrape across his forearm where a blade edge met the ledger's corner. Somebody pulled the ledger from his hands, and it landed near a stall of pottery. Sparks of sunlight hit its pages as people trod over the margins. Someone set the ledger alight with a flick of an oil lamp and the flame licked the edges. The afflicted woman, Hanan, lunged and grabbed the burning page. She pressed it to her chest. Her fingers blackened. Acolytes and townspeople scuffled. A shout came and then a shout answered. Men who had once bowed in the shrine now circled in factions. The high priest had fled. Ibrahim was detained by villagers who wanted answers. The eldest brother held Hanan and wept openly for the first time. When the heat died and the crowd thinned into angry groups, the chronicler staggered to his feet. Blood had dried on his sleeve. He found the ledger half charred and its cover singed. He set it on his knees and smoothed a page with cautious fingers. Ash puffed like grain. He saw two types of entries remain legible: formal petition language and a narrow spine of marginal instructions that ordered naming, linked seizures. He tore a clean strip of cloth from his robe and began to wipe ink smudges from a ledger page. The action steadied him. He took the charred edge to Aisha. "Aisha, look at this line. It ties names to property." He spoke without flourish. Aisha read and then said, "This changes the meaning of the rites." Her face held a new calculation. "This is not spirit alone. This is prophet cloaked in prayer." She spoke plainly. The chronicler nodded. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small brass magnifier. He traced letters with it and then wrote on a fresh scrap a list of names, dates, and the temple's recorded actions. He folded the scrap and slipped it into his journal. "We will record what happened today. We will copy these entries and leave copies where people can find them." He spoke in a voice that sought to convert anger into account. That evening in his candlelit study, he spread the ledger flat on the table. He had a bowl of water to soft, clean charred edges and beeswax to seal fragile pages. He worked with deliberate care, pulling smudged petitions straight and smoothing them with his palm. He wrote down each marginal note, copying the precise language of the temple's instructions. He noted those who had spoken in the market: Ibrahim, Aisha, the eldest brother Hanan. He listed men who had lost stalls and women who had come to petition against seizures. Each name was pinned to the ledger's evidence. He thought of the shrine steps, of the family pressing Hanan against stone, while Ibrahim had once demanded a name. He thought of the market, where someone had shouted about their stall. Those earlier moments now had new meanings. They were not merely rites. They were transactions recorded for advantage. The chronicler felt a shift from suspicion to clarity. He felt shame for those who had been used, and a hard resolve to make record his method. He carried the ledger to the window and watched the lane. Men moved like shawls. He saw Ibrahim sitting on a bench, hand bandaged, held by neighbors who argued over whether to keep him or hand him to a magistrate. He saw the eldest brother walking with Hanan supported by Aisha. He saw small crowds gather, whispering. The village had divided into protectors of the old order and those demanding accountability. He lit another candle and wrote a short account of the public rite. The reading, the scuffle, the priestess flight, the ledgers burning, the exposed marginalia, and Hanan's torn page. He included direct quotes from market witnesses. He wrote down what he had heard Ibrahim say in the courtyard gate. Orders come from above. He underlined that phrase and circled the high priest's name. Night settled and the study grew colder. The chronicler folded the ledger as burned corner into a wax folder. He tied the ledger with a leather thong and wrote a cover slip. Public record. Temple ledger extract. He hesitated and then added a second line. To be delivered to magistrate, to the market elders, and to the schoolmaster. He wanted witnesses, and he wanted the ledger to be read aloud in more than one place. At one point he heard a soft knock. He opened the door a crack. A boy from the market stood there, breath fogging in the evening air. He held out a small sealed packet. For you, the boy said, from the smith. He says, if you take the ledger to the magistrate, we will give you testimony. The boy's hands trembled. The chronicler took the packet and nodded. He returned to the ledger and smoothed the final page. He thought of the village's small economies. A rented stall, a divided inheritance, a mother who paid a priest to name a spirit instead of admitting debt. He thought of names used as levers. He thought of Hanan's torn page clutched against her chest. He wrote one final sentence to pin the day's shape. Naming has been used to move property and silence claims. He closed the ledger. He could have left it at that and handed it to magistrates, but he knew the system he had pierced. Authority would try to bury the record. He took the ledger and sealed the wax with the brass signet he wore. He closed the study door and set the ledger beneath his cloak. He planned his route to the magistrate's house at first light. Before he left the room, he wrote one small note and slid it under the door of the high priest's empty house. You were seen. The ledger burns, but the words remain. He did not stay to witness the effect. He walked out into a lane where someone began to sing a carpenter's work song, steady and unrelated to the day's violence. As he moved, he felt a final shift in himself, from investigative distance to active intervention. He had begun the morning with suspicion. The ledger had opened that suspicion into a demand for accountability. He had moved from curiosity to a decision that would place his name against the Temple-S. He had also gained an understanding. Naming could still be a tool. It could heal if used honestly. It could harm if used for profit. He set the ledger's weight beneath his jacket and stepped into the lane. A cart rattled past, and a woman called the name of her child. He walked with measured steps. At the corner he paused and looked back toward the temple, where a stray torch still burned. He felt the day's events reconfigure the village's power. He reached the magistrate's gate as the first thin light scraped the horizon. The magistrate's servant took the ledger and promised to show it to the council. The chronicler signed his name at the bottom of a receipt. He did not watch to see what the council would do. He walked away with a list of names and dates pressed against his chest, and the knowledge that records could be weapons and shields. That evening, in his study, he cleaned more soot from the ledger. He set aside a copy of Hanan's torn page. He lit a single candle and wrote a short note in a hand meant for witnesses. The ledger binds names to orders. Names must be freed by public inspection. He folded the note and left it on the table, where the boy from the market had once set a packet. He placed the ledger under his bed and sat with his hands flat on his journal. Outside, someone ran down the lane shouting a name. The chronicler rose, secured the ledger, and moved to the door. He opened it a crack and saw Aisha and the eldest brother arguing with a small group of villagers. They pointed to the magistrate's gate. Their mouths moved in urgent lines. The chronicler stepped forward, folded the ledger into his satchel, and followed them into the lane. He would not let the ledger vanish. He would carry its weight into courts, market squares, and schoolrooms. The ledger had bound more than names. It had revealed how belief and authority worked together. He had intended to preserve records. He left the study with the ledger and a new plan. To make the ledger's pages speak in town squares where judges and merchants listened. He closed the door and felt the sound of running feet down the lane. A knock came at his study door as he reached the street. He turned. A messenger had come, breathless, with a sealed summons from the magistrate asking him to bring all notes and witnesses for a hearing at dawn. The chronicler tightened the strap on his satchel and nodded. He had the ledger beneath his cloak. He set out for the magistrate's house, ledger heavy and certain, and the lane swallowed his footsteps.